Today, we're going to talk about everything that you need to know about vetting a deal at any size. This one's going to be a little bit of a larger deal. I'm going to walk you through, and it's actually something that I ended up walking away from. And I'll share some of the insights on what made me decide to walk away from the deal that was initially showing such great positive returns. So let's get into it. Welcome to Growing Empires. I'm Jennifer DeJesus, real estate investor and operator. This show takes you behind the scenes of how real estate assets are executed, managed, and positioned for long-term performance. Let's get into it. So what was the deal? This particular asset and project that I was going to acquire was actually part of a syndication. And we were looking at this to be a fairly long-term hold, probably like a 10-year hold. We initially located this in an area or asset class that we were focusing on, which was mobile home parks. And if any of you have invested in mobile home parks, you know that they provide some great consistent returns as long as you vet them appropriately. I'm actively looking at other mobile home parks in the state with some other partners, and hopefully we'll land one in the very near future. But this particular deal was 10 homes, and the way that it was situated was 2 homes were existing Cape Cod-style homes on the land that were built 50 plus years ago. The 8 additional homes were all brand new construction mobile homes that were put on permanent foundations in this complex. Now, the way that this was structured, there were 2 homes that sat up by the road, and then there was a shared driveway that came down around to the bottom area, which is where all the brand new 8 mobile homes sat. We additionally did our investigation, and our pre-investigation starts with looking at maps and looking at news articles or anything that we can find on the addresses. We look at the financials that are presented. We look at any pictures that are available. And we gather all the information that is available at our fingertips to make an assessment of the value of the property based on underwriting. Now, our underwriting is quite complex, especially when we're talking about a syndication, because not only are we looking at how the property performs, the income and expenses, but we're also looking for the GP/LP splits, the waterfalls, the investor returns, and then the additional fees that come with a standard syndication, potentially like acquisition fees, disposition fees, and there could be a myriad of other additional fees. Now, this particular deal didn't necessarily have all of those things, but you can imagine that our underwriting is pretty complex. So on the surface, when we're underwriting, the first thing that we're doing is plugging in all the numbers as the listing or as the seller presents. We're plugging in numbers based on taxes, insurance, income, expenses, everything that has been disclosed to us initially. And we are coming up with a kind of an idea of what we believe the variables to be, the changes in the deal, or things that could be impacted that we're going to want to dig into a little bit further on due diligence if we get through the first step. Mind you, I don't necessarily, in today's current market, take the step of going to view the property before I make an offer on it. And the reason, and I haven't done that actually in quite a few years, is as the market shifts, if you don't adjust your buying strategy, you will be left without opportunities. So as the market had shifted years ago, and we were finding so much more demand on good, viable properties, we adjusted our investment strategy and our purchase strategy to limit our access to the property until we got into due diligence. There's so much information that you can find online, and if you're resourceful and you have great underwriting, there shouldn't be any reason why you can't proceed with a deal, even if things come up on due diligence that you can negotiate. I had done all of our preliminary research with my team. We had looked through all of the information that was revealed, the new septic systems that had gone in for the additional units that were put on place. We looked up information on the road. We looked up information on the existing homes that were there, the leases in those homes, what the market rates were going to be for both the new construction and the existing homes, the location, the accessibility, population, job growth, economic factors, all the things that would play into your investment decision. And we plugged all of this into our spreadsheet based on, again, not our projections, but based on what the seller was stating as their true income and expenses on the project. And then we built in our additional returns that are needed for our investors and for the operational team, the asset managers, the GPs. And we came to a conclusion on what we believed the price needed to be to get this under contract. I'm happy to report that we were able to successfully negotiate a deal that made sense to us, and then we went into due diligence. Now, we don't take the acquisition side of this or the analysis side of the first step lightly, because when you get into due diligence, this is where you start to spend some money and you spend some real time. So we want to make sure that as a part of our initial underwriting, not only are we taking and making sure that the deal pencils based on what the seller is stating, we are also building in a couple of really important key factors. One is exit strategy. You have to know how you're going to exit this deal in real time. You have to know how to exit this deal or have a plan for if something goes wrong, like what could go wrong and how are you going to exit if it goes wrong? And what is your upside? What is your potential upside if all things go well? And once you have the initial underwriting from seller stated financials, and then you have your projections, both positive and negative, if the deal goes positively or if it goes south, if the market changes or something drastic happens, if all three of those areas identify that the deal is something you proceed with, you proceed, and then you go into due diligence. As a part of due diligence, this one was quite lengthy and it required an awful lot of time and an awful lot of expertise. So we had already had existing on the land septic systems. They were actually cesspools or sewage pits. From being in the area and knowing the local regulations, I can tell you that cesspools are no longer a viable source of sewage. So if you're going to add any kind of new units, you're going to have to add a new septic system. So what I was investigating was current cesspools and new septic systems that were installed to accommodate the new homes that were there. Now, anytime you add septic systems or you're investigating cesspools, there's inspections, there's permits, there's work with the sewage enforcement officers of the municipalities. And a lot of this information can be found by filling out a right-to-know request. A right-to-know request is typically a one-page form that you fill out, that you send to the municipality, and it gives you all the historical information on whatever topic you're asking for. My right-to-know request on this particular property was all about the cesspools, any previous inspections, whether they were deemed to be in working order or needing to be replaced, and then if they had used permits and the information from the sewage enforcement officer, as well as the local municipality, to identify that the installation of the new septic systems not only was compliant, but was inspected and permitted appropriately. After I gathered all that information, there was some questions in mind. And what I ended up doing was getting into contact with the sewage enforcement officer, asked him some questions. And then I also went to the municipality, talked to them about the investigations and the permitting and the sewage plans that were on record and got information on them. I was able to piece together that the seller had done things above board with the proper permitting, with the sewage enforcement officer, and the local municipality's help. So the good news is that everything there was inspected and in order. I did not, though, stop there from my investigation, because the new septic systems as well as the original cesspools, when they were inspected and permitted, was months ago. I didn't necessarily stop at gathering all this information because the original installation of the septic systems as well as the cesspool testing were done months ago. And the one thing that it does not factor in is future occupancy. Although these things are put in and they are tested as they are installed, we didn't have real life actually happening. I decided as a part of due diligence that I wanted to hire a septic company to come in and do what they call hydraulic load testing. And what that does is it essentially tests the water filtration into the system. So they dump hundreds of gallons, I think it's 400 gallons to be exact, into the system. And they watch it release over time to make sure that the septic system is functioning the way that it's supposed to. A hydraulic load is used on vacant properties, whereas there's different types of testing for units that are occupied. But in this particular case, I wanted to do a hydraulic load testing to test the stress of the system, right? How well will this system deal with stress once there are 8 additional occupied homes? Through that testing and through the knowledge of the septic company, I was able to uncover that there was one cesspool that attached itself to the previous homes that were existing that was not functioning appropriately. In worst case scenario, it was not able to be tested. And the reason it was not able to be tested is because it was on an embankment. So they were not able to test it because it could have caused harm to the system. And all previous records had indicated that it was no longer functioning. Now, with that being said, there was no obvious signs of it not functioning, but it had failed the standard test, meaning that it was likely beyond its life expectancy. I gathered this into my nice little package that I'm preparing for due diligence, put that kind of in my back pocket, and then moved on to the other things. The other critical components besides a right to know request and due diligence and thorough inspection of the property's condition, both structural and underground utilities and systems, is looking for issues with lot lines that can be solved by a survey or easements and those sorts of things. Remember, I had mentioned previously that this land was off of a shared driveway. Well, a shared driveway means that there's other people that have permitted right to use it. And if there is not agreements recorded, and they call them easement agreements, not only could there be a dispute in the future, but who maintains the road in the event of snow, ice, who paves it when it needs paving, who provides the road maintenance. There was no shared agreement or easement agreement recorded. That was yet another hurdle that we would have to uncover if we decided to proceed with this deal, that we would have to get an easement agreement recorded by all the neighbors that were surrounding this particular driveway to make sure that we were very clear on who was maintaining it, who was sharing the costs, and what were to happen if there was ever an issue with this shared road. In addition to those unique situations, there's the typical and standard kind of underwriting due diligence, which is to now verify all the income and expenses that the seller is suggesting. All of this can be done by the way of proof, and that's what you're asking for. So income can be verified by a couple of things. It can be verified by leases. However, leases don't prove that people are actually paying. Although leases will dictate whether or not they should be paying the rent that is stated, they also identify utilities that are paid by the tenant, renewal terms, if there's a security deposit, and any other specifics to their lease. But again, that does not verify that somebody is actually paying, and that's a really critical component to your due diligence. So yes, I have a lease, and yes, this lease says that you are supposed to be paying, but are you? Getting a tenant ledger or getting a rent payment history from the landlord is going to be critical. And then you want to make sure that the lease is well documented. If somebody tells you that the lease is not documented, or it's a verbal lease, or it's an expired lease, you can get an estoppel letter that is signed by the landlord and the tenant that illustrates these common key points that are in a lease that will aid in your protection once you take over ownership of the property. We verified the leases, and then through tenant payment history, we were able to verify the payments and everything checked out. Then we went on to the expenses. Because these were single-family homes, it was pretty obvious that the tenants were paying all expenses, all utilities, as would be typical in a single-family home. I had to verify all of that information. Not only did I verify it when I was on inspection by talking to the tenants specifically to verify what they were paying for, I was able to verify it by the lease and then verify it by the financials that the seller had prepared for us, which actually came from his tax returns. Based on his tax returns, his Schedule E, we were able to verify what the landlord was paying, and it did align with what the leases said, what the tenants said, and what we believed to be in our initial underwriting. Income and expenses checked out. Then we went into our kind of preparatory due diligence regarding things that can change. Taxes will change. These are brand new homes that just got put on the land. The property was going to be reassessed at some point. What were those new taxes going to be? I had to do a little bit of digging with the tax authority, the municipality, to identify what the tax assessments would be. Prior to things being assessed, although they can't give you an exact, what they can give you is the formula. You can also not only take the formula from the municipality, but you can also look at new development or new construction in the areas surrounding it to give you an idea of what the millage rates and the calculations would be to figure out the assessment. I was able to figure out what the assessment was going to be. And because we knew that this was new construction, we'd already budgeted in our underwriting for the increases in taxes. I will tell you that our initial underwriting was a little light on what it could have been. So what we did was we looked at the new potential worst case scenario and added that to our underwriting before we went back to renegotiate. And the last but not least is insurance. Insurance is one of those really sticky situations where you can never, under any circumstances, assume that the insurance policy that the current owner has, even if you get their policy, that is going to be your rates. There is no such thing. In insurance, it's called a reissue rate. Every reissue rate is always higher. So you need to assume that there is going to be an increase in your insurance premiums. Never go by what the seller is telling you. Make sure that as a part of your due diligence, you are reaching out to your insurance provider and getting those quotes during your due diligence so that if those numbers fluctuate greatly, you can use that to renegotiate come time of the end of your due diligence. Once we gathered all of our income and expenses, we had done our right to know request, we had talked to the municipality, and we had done our actual physical investigation and compiled a list of things that we were going to go back to the seller with. We were able to go back to the seller with some very key things that were not initially identified on the underwriting, which is when we went under contract. One was the lack of easement agreement. Another was the failed cesspool. We had an adjustment in taxes that was a little higher than what we were planning. And then the other thing that was very obvious in our physical inspection, but not disclosed initially, was that the roadways that were put in were only temporary surfaces. They were not permanent surfaces. In road construction, you think about the stone that as cars are passing, it melts together and it kind of forms a hard surface. That's what the road was. That is the underlayment of actual blacktop. It's the first layer of it, right? So they use this crushed stone that kind of melts together, I guess is the best way to describe it. I'm certainly not a construction guy, as you can tell. But it forms a hard surface and a drivable surface, but it is not a permanent surface. The permanent surface is the blacktop and the final coatings. That in itself was an additional probably $30,000 or $40,000 that needed to be added in immediate maintenance costs because that temporary road surface would have only gone through maybe one full 4-season cycle in the state of Pennsylvania before it needed to be permanently surfaced. We had to think about that. And then those other things that I mentioned, the easement agreements, the septic, the taxes, all of those gave us the conclusion that we needed to go back and renegotiate for price and terms. Unfortunately, we were not able to come up with a conclusion that worked for all parties. So we did end up terminating the deal. There's a very key lesson here that I want to share, and it's that no due diligence should truly ever be waived. If you want to protect your investments, whether they be big or small, you want to make sure that you do a thorough analysis. Trust but verify is the recommended method that I suggest all the time. We want to assume that everybody is being truthful and honest, but you want to verify everything that you're being told. Number one, you're not making mistakes and not thinking thoroughly through pieces of things. Again, a brand new septic system with proper permits, you would assume that everything was okay. In our inspection, it turned out to be okay, but we did uncover another problem that was going to be costly during the ownership. Those are just some examples of things where further due diligence and further protection will just help you be the best informed investor you can be and potentially prevent you from getting into situations where you made one critical mistake that has disrupted the entire returns on your investment purchase. At any time, if you'd love to go deep into something that you're working on, I'm always just a phone call away. I love having these conversations with investors, and I love helping everybody make informed decisions about their investments. And whether that investment decision is to move forward or walk away, you're making the most informed decision with the best information at your fingertips using that trust but verify method. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and until next time, take care. That's it for now. If passive income from real estate investments plays a role in your long-term investment strategy, this show is for you. Thanks for listening, and for more in-depth resources, please head over to growingempires.com.